Thank you very much.
Yeah, the cloud is more space than this room.
All right, well, welcome everybody. Shabbat Shalom. Good morning to our first monthly Learning Torah together at Temple Aaron. We're very excited about it. We ought to probably begin by saying a Shehechianu, right? Because we're starting something new, right? It's actually as old as time immemorial studying Torah, but this is a new gathering and just a whole new adventure into learning about the Torah and seeing what it can give us in terms of guidance for how to live our lives. So we can start with Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Shehechianu V'Kiyamanu V'Higianu Lazman Hazeh. Thank you, God, for keeping us alive and sustaining us and enabling us to share this special moment for all of us. I'm really delighted to be with everyone.
Turn it off.
And I'd like to just spend the first, minute or two, if people wouldn't mind, just going around and introducing yourselves and just saying where you're from. So I'm Rob Lennick. I live in Albuquerque. The greatest honor in my life is to be the rabbi of Temple Aaron, and I'm just so glad to be with all of you. Who wants to go next?
I'm Jay Davis.
No.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Zoll.
Oh, I'm Stuart Zoll. I'm originally from New Jersey, live in Greenwood Village, Colorado, and excited to hear about what Rabbi Lennick has to say.
Thank you.
I'll go
I'm
next.
Jay Davis. I live in Nevada, Colorado, and happy to be participating in the Temple Aaron.
Wonderful.
Hi, I'm Sharon Niederman. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, now you're muted, Sharon.
You just muted yourself.
Sharon, you're muted now. Oops. Oh, no. Can we read lips?
Well, does anyone know how to lip read?
I
She says
know.
she's from Peoria, Illinois, and very excited to be with us.
Sharon, we'll have to come back. There you go. Now can you do it again?
Okay, it says I'm muted though.
Yeah,
No, now you're.
No, you're unmuted now.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, hi, good morning. Sharon Niederman from Raton. Very happy to be with you. Good Shabbos.
Good job to you too.
I'm Ron Rubin. I am from Colorado Springs now, originally from Raton, New Mexico. We grew up, my brother and I, and in Temple Aaron in Trinidad. And so it is wonderful to see all of you on this call and to have a thriving Jewish community back at Temple Aaron again. Shabbat Shalom.
Okay, I'll go. I'm Karen Joe, and I'm from Denver, also in Vail right now. And a friend of mine named Jerry Radetsky has sent me the link to the Inquisition movie from Temple Aaron, that event. And then I just sort of kind of took off from there and wanted to do more involved with that, and happy that it's still there and that it's got a grant to rebuild or refinish or whatever. And so that's great. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation as well.
Wonderful. Thank
Good
you.
to have you, Karen.
Hi, I'm Hank Sachs, and
Cynthia Patterson.
we live in Rochester, Taos, and we've been friends of Jay Davis's for many, many decades. And we've not ever been inside Temple Aaron, but we did drive by it once a few years ago and have been meaning to get over there, but this COVID thing kind of keeps us away. So we hope
Yeah.
to get there one day.
We'll look forward to seeing you.
Yeah. Wait, so it was Hank and, I'm sorry, what was your name? Hank and
Cynthia.
Cynthia?
Yeah.
Good to meet you.
We have Jay's on our screen because he sent us the link to this, I guess. That's why that came up that way.
Oh, that's it. Oh.
Okay.
Who else do we have?
Was Bob?
Bob Weber?
Yeah, I'm Bob Ibar. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I'm a Temple Aaron attendee from the 1950s with Randy and Ron, and recently moved back to Colorado, live in Evergreen now.
Great.
Wonderful.
Good to meet you.
Yeah, nice to see you on the call, Bob.
We can see about half of you, not all of you.
That's all right.
About half of me.
Yeah, there you go.
Here's another half. Sure. And Sherry and Neil Paul, happy to be here. We're delighted to have the beginning of this Torah study. And yeah, if you check out the website and everything that you're reading, it comes from Sherry. So she's been behind all this. Thanks, guys. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Oh, I see Raleigh up there.
Nice
Raleigh?
to meet everybody.
Hi, can you hear
Hi.
me?
We can hear you. We just can't see you.
That's because I'm eating breakfast. You don't want to watch me. Hi, I'm Raleigh Dove, and I live in Colorado Springs, just moved down from Monument. I've been in El Paso County since 1979, and have been driving by Temple Aaron for a million years, and used to schlep my little kids by there every time we went down the highway and say, look. So I'm thrilled that it is being, the community's being renewed. And I was at the celebration, the birthday or whatever it was, and look forward to coming to things in the future. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat
Wonderful.
shalom.
All right, let's get right into this today. I think everybody, good to meet you. And today we're going to talk about kind of an interesting topic. Why does the Torah begin with the letter Bet? And before we actually look at what the tradition has to say about that, I just want to lay out some opening ideas. Some people ask, what does the word Torah actually mean? How do we translate the word Torah? Well, we usually think of it as the 5 books of Moses. That's Torah with a capital T, or the Pentateuch, as it's sometimes called. There's also a concept of Torah with a small t, which the rabbis referred to as all of Jewish knowledge, could be called Torah with a small t. But the word Torah itself, when we refer to the 5 books of Moses, even within the Torah and in the Hebrew Bible itself, the word Torah comes from the word or, meaning light. And so Torah is often translated colloquially as instruction. And so the Torah provides instruction in a number of different ways. The most obvious kind of instruction it gives us is by the stories that it tells us, the stories of our matriarchs and patriarchs, the Mosaic story, the story of the Israelites in their exile, wandering across the desert. All of these stories, obviously, some have a moral quality, but there's a lot to be learned just by what's written there, without going any deeper, just by looking at the stories. But then Jewish tradition always wants to go deeper than what's on the surface of the page. And we do that because we also get instruction from the Torah metaphorically. We find metaphorical information in the Torah where things represent other things. And we look to try to discover what those things might be. And this morning is going to be the first of, I'm sure, many opportunities where we're going to look metaphorically and then also symbolically at what's written there, what the words are saying on the page versus what is written beneath the surface of the words. And in this sense, one could say, we can read the Torah in many different ways. In some ways, the way we're going to read it today could be considered poetic. We're going to approach it like it's poetry in a sense, although we're going to do more than just reading the literature, but we're going to look for what meanings can be drawn out from the words that are written on the page. We also get instruction historically because the Torah is filled, not all with necessarily perfectly accurate history, but there's historical instruction also in the Torah about how our ancestors experienced God, how they observed their version of the Jewish religion. There's also theological instruction where, some might argue the main character of the Torah and the main character of the Bible is God. And in that sense, the Torah gives us theological instruction, tells us something about God, which today we're going to look at much more deeply. Then there's also the revelation of the 613 mitzvot, the commandments. We get literally instruction about how to conduct our lives. There are ritual commandments, there are ethical commandments. And then lastly, and this is what I call the rarefied air of Torah study, is the Kabbalistic instruction or the mystical, or what in Hebrew is called the sod, the secretive meanings of the Torah. And, those are accessible in a lot of different ways. And we're actually going to encounter a little bit of Kabbalah this morning as well. In fact, whenever we study Torah, it's good to keep your eyes open for all of these different types of elements that are going on simultaneously. The second point, just as an opening idea, well, let me stop with that. Any questions about this first idea, Torah as instruction, and the different types of instruction it provides us? Okay. Second thing I want to mention, just as an opening idea, and next month we're going to look at this in detail, and it's a wonderful, if you've never encountered this before, it's a great experience. We're going to talk about two theories of the Torah's origin. And that's always an interesting conversation. Where did the Torah come from? How did we get it? And the two main theories, one is theological. It's called Torah mi Sinai. Where did the Torah come from? Just as we were taught growing up, the Torah was given to Moses on Mount Sinai at a single moment of revelation, a moment in time, an actual theophany, an encounter between heaven and earth, where God and Moses, as the Bible says, were together. And Moses was given the tradition, and that is the fundamental basis of traditional Jewish belief. The other theory, however, is a relatively modern theory from the 19th century when it was first cast, called the documentary hypothesis. And it's a whole completely different literary approach to understanding the origin of the Bible and the Torah in particular. And next month at our meeting in February, we're gonna take a really much closer look at that. So where do we start? So I couldn't help, but whoops. We start with ABC. I actually had Mary Martin. I was going to have her sing "Where Do We Start" and ABC and Do Re Mi, but it didn't work. So we'll just make believe we just listened to her sing that. It was a good attempt. Rob's technology didn't work right then. Where to start? A very good place to start. We begin with ABC, and in Hebrew, Aleph, Bet, and Gimel. That's where we start. So we have the order of the alphabet, the order of the Aleph, Bet, and we might expect the Torah. Hold on one second. We might expect the Torah to begin with the first letter, with the letter Aleph, which would seem like a very good place to start. And yet the Torah does not begin with the first letter, Aleph. It starts with the second letter, Bet. And the question for today is, why? Now, typically in the history of Judaism, there are many answers. And I will tell you that it's so funny being a rabbi in the following way. People, will always ask rabbis many different questions. And they'll say, what's Judaism's view of afterlife? And then I'll say, well, do you want the answer from 1,000 years BCE? You want the answer from the year 150 BCE? You want the answer from the year 300 BCE? CE? Do you want the answer from Spain in the 15th century? Do you want the answer from the Enlightenment? Do you want the answer from contemporary Jewish thinkers? There's never one answer in Jewish tradition, and it's one of the things I love about Jewish tradition. You know, a lot of people who choose Judaism later in life come from traditions that are often very monolithic. And it's the fact that they were monolithic that was part of what didn't work, and come to Judaism and are actually at first just blown away by the fact that our tradition is not monolithic. We have many answers to every question, and we have a very open-ended attitude about many, many fundamental issues and questions. So there are many answers to the question, why does the Torah begin with a bet? So we should think this should be any different. So here's the first answer. And the answers I'm going to share this morning and we'll talk about come from the Midrash. The Midrash is rabbinical lore that grew up during about a 400-year period from 200 BCE to 200 CE. But there are stories, they use stories to explain stories. And so what we're going to look at today is some things that come right from the Midrash. And the first is this little story. I just have to move this out of the way. There we go. So before the world was created, according to the Midrash, the letters of the alphabet presented themselves before God. The letter Aleph then announced, I should be used to create the world, since I'm the first letter of the alphabet. But God replied, no, I will create the world with the letter Bet, because, and I love this Midrash, it's the first letter of the word bracha, which means blessing. And then God says, if only my world will be for a blessing. What do we learn from this little story? What do you think we learned from this?
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yep.
How are the letters created before the world was created?
That's a good question.
You're not supposed to ask that one.
That's a very good question.
How were the letters created before the world was created? So, believe it or not, that is in the next answer that we're going to come to.
Okay.
So you got to just hold on. Just hold on a little bit longer. It's a very good question because it's a question of more than simply how the letters were created ahead of time, as we'll see. But just take note of the fact that the rabbinical writers were trying to suggest with this Midrash, God created the world for goodness, for blessing. The world, it's saying that the world is designed, inclined toward blessing. So what might that actually mean? The world is designed to be inclined toward blessing. And then God says, if only my world will be for a blessing, hoping that it would turn out that way. What do you think it's suggesting? I think it's suggesting that the world is not, it's not like the universe. Creation is not a neutral phenomenon. It's inclined toward the good, but we have to bring it out. We bring it out. So, for example, the elements for penicillin, the elements for a vaccine for COVID-19 were put into the world ahead of time by the Creator so that we would then apply our minds, discover those things for the betterment of the world. But this is a belief that says those good things, those elements, the things that go into the recipe to make goodness, to make blessing, God put them there on purpose to be discovered. That's a very different view than just the traditional scientific view of creation, saying that, is that the world is built not only with the laws of nature, but it's built and designed with potential for blessing. And to think the Creator created with that in mind, that I'm starting with the bet to remind everyone that the whole purpose behind this is to create the potential for blessing. And then the Midrash here ends and says the Aleph, as the first letter in the alphabet, was given a different honor. It was selected to be the first letter of the 10 Commandments, with the word Anochi, the first word of the 10 Commandments, as you can see right here, Anochi, which means I am.
Can I ask a dumb question?
No dumb questions, all good questions.
Well, like, you know how in Hebrew, they'll use the consonants to build the words, but they don't really always use the vowels. They'll just drop those off and just use the consonants to write Hebrew words. So maybe it's as simple as that was the first real letter, because the vowels are sort of subservient.
Say more, I'm not sure I understand.
Well, when you read lots of Hebrew, they don't always use the vowels underneath the letters.
Well,
they'll just use.
Isn't the olive silent? I mean, it's a silent letter.
It is considered a silent letter.
So maybe that's why this is the first one that it's a noise bet,
I think that's a great interpretation. So God doesn't begin with a silent letter because the world doesn't begin in silence. The world begins with a great sound, with a great presence, with a great impact. Maybe that's why it's called the Big Bang, not the Big Silence.
Yeah, good.
That's a nice.
Well, what about the other one? Is if you use the English, you could say God took a bet on man.
That's fabulous. So what you realize, what you're doing right now is you are creating Midrash. You're creating Midrash right now, and that is fabulous. If we all could come away feeling that kind of freedom when we read the Torah or relate to it and think about it and bring our own mind to bear, just like this, that's just fantastic. I have to say Yasher Koach for that. God made a bet. I love it. It's like cross-linguistic interpretation. That's great. So here's another answer. And this is going to go to the question about the letters before creation. Another answer says the Torah starts with the letter bet because of the shape of the letter. Consider its shape. The bet is closed on 3 sides, top, right, and bottom, and open on the left. This suggests that the Torah is concerned with everything that happens from the moment of creation onward. We cannot know what came before creation or how God came into existence, or for that matter, how the letters came into existence. We can't know the ultimate secret of what is above, below, or before. And in that Midrash, and I'll go back one more time. If you look at the arrows inside the bet, so the bet represents the barriers of our knowledge, the barriers, the limits of human comprehension. And so we can't go back behind the curtain. We cannot pull back the curtain, but maybe just a tiny bit. But what we can do, creation is set up according to this Midrash to go forward. And the big ideas in this Midrash, and I consider this, Jews don't talk about faith very much. and this is partly the reason why. Faith in Judaism begins with the acceptance of an unknowable mystery. And this notion that we start from the principle that God is unknowable leaves us with, well, then what do we talk about? When we talk about God, how do Jews do that? It's very difficult. And that's why most of Jewish tradition has been about the deeds of Judaism as opposed to the creed or the faith of Judaism. I often say Judaism is a religion of deeds. First and foremost, we acknowledge God's existence. That can mean many different things, of course. But then once we do that, we're supposed to move on from there and act upon that unknowable mystery, which sounds completely contradictory. We should act based on our knowledge or lack of knowledge about an unknowable mystery. And because it's unknowable, and the shape of the letter bet being what it is, the Midrash is teaching that creation is not about the past. It's about newness. It's about the future. It's about a continuing process. And it shows that there's a very strong stream of thought in Judaism, very much oriented to the future. And going to say more about that a little further into this. See, here's the logic. This is the logic that the rabbis brought to this by saying we can't know what's above, below, and behind the bet. The logic is this: if we can know God before the beginning, then we are ascribing to God a beginning. All beginnings imply an end. If we ascribe a beginning to God, then we must also ascribe an end to God as well, and that would make God finite. And this idea comes from Kabbalah. In Judaism and Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah teaches God is called an Ein Sof, that which has no end and no beginning.
And so, yeah.
The Ein Sof. And so you can see that the bet is being interpreted now. Why is it the Torah begin with a bet? Because the bet helps preserve the idea, the reality of the Ein Sof. Because you can't ascribe God a beginning, because if that's true, God has an end. And if God has an end, God is finite. And if God is finite, God is not an Ein Sof anymore. Interesting how they thought. So the letter bet is illustrating that God is infinite, without beginning or end, because such things are beyond our comprehension. Any comments about that?
Well, that would sort of like make, how do I say it? That would be like looking at the letter bet as almost like a pictograph. I mean, are there other examples in the Torah where that happens?
Yes, in fact, there are, and I'm going to show you those as we learn together. There are many, many examples where letters in the Torah are either enlarged or they're made miniature, and they're written in calligraphy consistently according to the tradition in this way. And there are hidden messages found in these extra large letters or these little letters, or at least their interpretations to try to give them meaning. And so, yes, so you can see that we get instruction from the text of the Torah pictographically, symbolically. Letters mean numbers, words can have many meanings, which we're going to look at an example of that this morning as well, in the next one coming up. And so, yes, pictographic interpretation, the rabbis loved to do it. And Kabbalists especially love to do it.
Kabbalists?
Kabbalists, people who study Kabbalah, or Jewish mysticism.
Rabbi, why do you think that they thought that if something has a beginning, it has to have an end? Because I'm just thinking of going back to my high school geometry. And I wonder where in history these two things, relate to each other. But there's the concept of array, which starts at a point and then goes forever. It does not end. So that's not, there's something else out there that does have a beginning and not an end.
Well, array only goes as far as the graph extends. So, I mean, yes, it looks like array is an infinitely continuing line.
That still starts at one fixed point. So it has a beginning but no end. At least that's how I always thought of it.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, I think that, you know, it's really responding to the concept of science, the scientific concept that all things in existence ultimately came into existence and will go out of existence. And the notion of God being limited in that way, subject to the same laws of nature as the rest of the physical scientific world, is, I think, part of what they're trying to protect. I think also that, well, we're going to deal with this. This is really what the whole lesson today ends up being about, which is what are the consequences if we work with a God concept that says we can know with certainty who God is. Like, what are the consequences of that? I mean, if we could know who God really is and we had that concept in our possession, how do you think that go for us?
If you believe that God has a beginning, then the next question ultimately is,
Let me see those there.
What came before God? How was God created if you believe God had a beginning?
Right, but you know, at least this perspective on creation, the rabbis are teaching us, I'm not saying I agree with it, the rabbis are teaching us that it's going to be beyond human comprehension to know who created God. Now, I don't know, that could turn out to be wrong. I mean, we could turn out that the whole universe, who knows, we're inside a computer. Maybe this whole thing is a digital manifestation and we're all just digital creatures, you know, that have been pre-programmed by players outside. I mean, maybe this universe is a computer game and God was the designer of the game. I mean, but again, even that's metaphorical. So, but the rabbis were saying that if you want to talk about, you know, the origin of God and put God's beginning to a particular point in time, what does that actually mean? Like, does that mean it's time according to time on Earth? It's time in another realm somewhere out in the solar system or 10 galaxies away from here? You know, where do you mark the spot where that ray begins? And that's partly what this midrash is saying, is that there's no way to know that. Even if you wanted to say, well, somewhere out there, there's a place where the ray of God begins. And it goes off into the universe, and that ray of light led to, you know, the Big Bang and everything else. You still have the circular problem that it would be impossible to pinpoint time and place. You could theorize there was a point, time, and place, but how could you possibly actualize that, quantify that? You can only do it theoretically. And I think that's what they're saying, that there's going to be a limit to our knowledge when it comes to the Creator and creation, no matter what. And the rabbis are suggesting, and will be better for it, that actual limit in our knowledge is a blessing. I think I may have told this story. Might have told it on Rosh Hashanah. I don't remember, but I once had this experience. When I came out of rabbinic school, I was in Denver, at Temple Emmanuel. And I was there for 3 years and I loved working with Steve Foster, and it was a great experience. And as the junior rabbi, I got sent out to do a lot of interesting things. And one of them was to lead a Passover Seder at the Episcopal Cathedral in Denver. And this would have been in 1985. And so I led a model Seder for the Episcopalians at the cathedral. And there, I'd say about 100 people there, and there was a dais. And in the middle of this model Seder, a man walked in with clergy garb with 2 attendants. Long story short, it's the Archbishop of Canterbury, who happens to show up in Denver that week, and came to visit the cathedral and walked in, and very kind, lovely man. Could I join you? Of course. Sat down. We had this public conversation about faith and redemption. It was wonderful. And then I asked him the following question. I was young and brash, and I asked him, I said, could you tell me something I don't understand? I'm a Jewish prophet. Obviously I'm Jewish, but when it comes to, when it comes to Jesus, is it like, is Jesus 100% divine, 100% human? Is it 50-50? Is it 60-40? Like how do you understand that? And he looked at me and he said the following, and it's right to what we're discussing right now. He said, oh, Rabbi, the answer to that question was given to the world by the Jewish people. I went, really? He said, absolutely. He said, the fact of the matter is, the answer to your question about the nature of Jesus is called the mystery of the church. And then he said, and God forbid we ever figure it out. God forbid we ever figure it out. There'll be no need for a church. There'll be no need for anything, because then people will be arrogant and think they know everything. So God forbid we should ever figure it out. And it was the Jewish people who taught us that God always remains unknowable. I'd say Jewish people taught us how important it is to preserve the mystery.
There's a huge historical component to that too. There used to be all these different sects of Christianity that debated that very point, like, very fine theological distinctions, and the Catholic Church essentially crushed them all. Yes. They're the dominant institution, because they crushed all of those sects with different ideas, even though they're just a lot of them are very tiny differences to Catholic doctrine.
So now what I want to do is I want to go on with another answer to the question, why does the Torah begin with a bet? So let's pull this up again. We can all see it. So, whoops, I'm covered up here. So here's another answer. A major textual difficulty in the account of creation concerns the creation of light. God created light on the first day, but the sun and stars were only formed on the fourth day. So what kind of light was created on day one? According to the sages, the light of the first day was no ordinary light, not the light of the sun or the moon or reflected light in the physical world. They teach it was the light of the mind, the light of consciousness. And then they go on and say it is taught that God placed this light of the mind into the Torah itself before creation. So where did the letters come from? They came from God taking this mystical light, this light of the mind, this light of the consciousness, infusing it into the words of the Torah. And the sages taught the first word of the Torah proves this lesson. Now, this is also, now we're going to look at another kind of interpretation, a method of interpretation. So they take the first word of the Torah, which is Bereshit, Bereshit here in Hebrew and in English. Oops. Hold on. And here's what they did with it. So they said the word Bereshit, this is usually translated as how we heard it growing up. In the beginning, Bereshit, in the beginning. And then it says, Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning, God created. And so the bet here, with which the Torah begins, the bet, the first letter, is being translated as in the beginning, Bereshit. But the bet, according to the rabbis, and according to Hebrew itself, can also be translated not as in, but can be translated as with. So they go on, and the first word and phrase broken down looks like this. With Reshit, something called Reshit, with Reshit bara Elohim, meaning with Reshit, this thing called Reshit, with Reshit, God created. And so they ask, so what is Reshit? So God created with something. The first word is not talking about in the beginning at all. The first word is talking about how God created. And they say the bet means with, it's with Reshit. So what is Reshit? Hold on. I'm having a problem.
Uh-oh.
There we go.
Oh.
So, okay, so I'll do it this way, it'll be safer. Reshit, that word Reshit, derives from the root resh and shin. Resh and shin. And depending on how you add vowels to those letters, you come up with different words. And it turns out that the resh and the shin is the root of the word rosh,
And, yeah.
which means?
Head, it means head.
It means head. It means head, which to the rabbis means mind. So they interpret it. The first word and phrase of the Torah is translated in the Midrash, Bereshit bara Elohim, with mind God created. With mind God created. Meaning God placed that supernal light into the Torah before creation. And thus the Torah is saying, this is exactly what the rabbis wrote. With mind as Torah, with mind Torah as a blueprint, God created. So that actually the Torah existed before creation, the letters existed before creation, God existed before creation. But when God created, what is this Midrash trying to teach? And the fact it's all around the interpretation of that first letter, bet, meaning with, not in. Big ideas here. God created consciously, mindfully, purposefully, with structure, by design. And that's why you can make a very strong case as one interpretation of Jewish belief, something we heard about some time back, the whole concept of intelligent design. The world was intelligently designed, and therefore, number two, creation is then a reflection of God's mind. Now, if you're a pantheist, you would say creation and God are one and the same thing. But there are many other ways to conceptualize God. But the rabbis and traditions try to teach that if you want to study God, study the universe. But while we can know and learn about creation, we can learn and know about the universe, we can learn about the design. The first letter bet still reminds us that God is and must remain a mystery. Thoughts about that?
I think I have heretical thoughts about this.
That's good. You know what? And that's great. And this is a good place to talk about that. Let me also say to everybody, you know, I'm not dogmatic at all about Judaism or Jewish belief. We're all works in progress. And one of the biggest elements of belief is doubt. You just survey the so-called most faithful people in history. Many of them edged on the border of giving up their faith many times. They struggled with issues of non-existence, and they struggled with issues of capricious God, and they struggled with why evil happens in the world. And for many, their faithfulness, the equation of their faithfulness could only be measured in terms of the doubt that was always operative at the heart of their faith. Because faith is not about knowing. I think that's the thing that's important. Faith is not about certainty. I mean, I always feel suspicious, and you see it in just about every religious tradition, you know, people who walk around saying, I am certain, my faith is absolute, my faith is certain. And Judaism has always said, be careful with that. So you might not be as much of a heretic as you think, Sherry.
I mean, to me, what you're talking about here seems to, you know, maybe support some, you know, some things I understand about, you know, consciousness being at the root of it all. And I wonder if that's what it's pointing to.
It is, in fact, when you set out to study Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and once you get into it a little bit, you realize what they're trying to do. Their whole idea of Kabbalah is that in every human person, there's a droplet of God's consciousness. That actually the light that's on in our head, our conscious awareness, and even our unconscious awareness, the idea of being conscious and having a conscience, the fact that we as creatures do that, and I think there are more creatures that do that than we realize, maybe just using different languages than we do, maybe with completely different concepts of reality than we have, but the idea, the light is on in the head of a creature. Kabbalah says that light is a droplet of God's light or of God's mind. And what Kabbalah does, since they can't study God directly, they've developed a whole structure to try to study the human person and how that droplet of God's mind gets expressed in the whole life of an individual. And that's what the sefirot, or the spheres, or these different aspects of God's reality are described when you get into Kabbalah, and you look at their design, their picture, and they're very pictographic. In Kabbalah, they describe a picture of what they call the aspects of God present in every human being. And they're basically saying that's like a photograph of what's in God's mind. So that is exactly the direction God wants, Judaism wants to go. And, you know, it's interesting because there's some stuff coming out in quantum physics, and I just read an article, I think just in the last month, about how they're moving closer and closer to a whole new conception of the physical universe as being an expression of consciousness. Which the rabbis have been saying for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you, what examples within Judaism reinforce this notion that God cannot be known? And here's just a few. The Torah is filled with images referring to God, where God is described in non-objective terms and in the form of riddles or contradictions. most notably the burning bush. A bush burns, not consumed, totally a contradiction scientifically, although there might be examples in nature, where one might see that. But the point was that God's presence was presented in the form of a conundrum. Secondly, Moses asked God, "Tell me your name." God answers, "Ehiyeh asher ehiyeh." It's been badly translated as "I am that I am." It really is in the future. It says, "I will be what I will be," which means I can't even tell you, I won't even tell you what I was. I won't even tell you what I am. And since you can't predict the future, you can't know what I will be. Again, non-objective, open-ended, and left an unfulfilled definition in a sense. God says to Moses, "You cannot see my face and live." A lot of interpretation about that phrase, but literally meaning that to be directly in God's presence would be beyond the capacity of a human creature, or any creature for that matter. And then also, listen, the second commandment after the first just says, "I am God." And then the second commandment, we have a complete rejection of idolatry, that there can be no images or containers of this God. Or in other words, God cannot be in the form of an incarnation, right? So God being incarnate in the character of Jesus, or God being incarnate in a statue, God being incarnate in a picture. Judaism completely rejects that. Though there are some exceptions in the Torah. God does appear, like with the Israelites wandering in the desert, as a pillar of smoke or fire, but the idea of God's being anthropomorphic in any way, in a human image, completely rejected. And so, and it's really interesting because I used to, when I started studying, and I spent a lot of time studying Christian theology because I wanted to understand clearly. I was fascinated with the birth of Christianity and how something so completely different than Judaism could actually evolve. And I used to think, I wonder if some Jews have incarnation envy. Because although I could never be a Christian personally, when I talk to Christians, there's something so amazingly comforting in the presence of the Jesus image, in the presence, in the notion of the incarnation, that which was way out in the far beyond, all of a sudden is present on this planet. Of course, that's a Gnostic idea, the idea of an external force coming and entering in to our history, and Christianity really, latched onto that Gnostic idea, but that is exactly where Judaism and Christianity part ways. We do not believe in incarnation. The only incarnation that we, if you wanted to describe it as such, that we believe in is that, God comes into the world in the words of the Torah itself. And that's it. The word is the incarnation. And by the way, that idea that the word, and that means the Torah, and when the Greeks used the word, they meant the Torah. You have to remember in the book of John, one of the most poignant, important verses for Christians, where it says the word was made flesh. When John uses that phrase, the word, he means the Torah. The Torah was made flesh. Jesus is sort of like a human Torah. That's what John meant when he wrote it. Of course, it's been developed to mean much more than that. But understand, if there is any incarnation in Judaism, it's the word. That's it. That's the degree to which God becomes concrete and accessible to us, at least according to Jewish tradition. Can you think of any other examples that reinforce this notion so central in Judaism that God cannot be known? Can you think of any others?
Is that where literally the word God in more orthodox belief, instead of using the three-letter word, they hyphenate G and D?
Excellent example. Yes. So because God cannot be known. God can't be limited to anything specific. And so we can't even write God's name, G-D, because if we wrote the name out, we're limiting God as if God could be captured in one name. Or the four-letter name of God, the Tetragrammaton. We could do a whole lesson on it. You know, Yud, He, Vav, He. Israelites are not allowed to say it out loud. Sometimes translated or to be pronounced as Yahweh, completely mistranslated in the word Jehovah. But that four-letter word they weren't supposed to say. They said instead Adonai. Again, to sort of maintain this level, a constant reminder, there are things about God that cannot be known. Good example. So let me ask you, what is the benefit and the wisdom of this theological perspective? And I think that's, go ahead.
I was going to say, hopefully it keeps people humble and learning. Hopefully.
Hopefully. Anyone else?
Yeah, part of the benefit is it gives, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, part of the benefit is it gives no answers. So it keeps you on your toes forever. And it doesn't make you stupid by nature.
It's like learning is limitless.
Hank, would you like to equate absolute certainty with a brand of stupidity?
Yeah, you got it.
Yes. And that's really what,
right.
That's really at the heart of today's lesson. You know, when I lived in Arkansas, being the first full-time rabbi in Northwest Arkansas ever, you know, I was in a sea of people who were very strongly Southern Baptist. And for some, I was the first Jewish person they ever met, and most certainly the first rabbi that they ever met. And, you know, and many attempts were made to, you know, save me. And I eventually had a conversation with the person who's one of my closest friends now, Southern Baptist, you know, completely different worldview than mine, completely. A person I would never have even imagined I could be friends with. And over the years, we become very good friends. But I once asked him, you know, the following, you know, I sort of presented the following idea to him. I said, look, let's imagine you have a parent. The parent owns a house. And the parents got lots and lots and lots and lots of children and relatives. And the parent says, look, you can all stay in this house, but I just have two rules, but they're not negotiable. Under any circumstances, they're not negotiable. One is, in the morning, I'm going to hold up a yellow card. And when I hold up the yellow card, it means wake up, get dressed, wash up, go to work, go to school, go out, live in the sunshine. When you come home at the end of the day, I'm going to hold up a blue card. It means time to go to bed, get dressed, time to lay down, wash up, say your prayers, go to sleep. That's all I require. And if you do that, you can stay in my house for eternity. And then you got a whole group of the children over here off to the side saying, but hello, we have a question. We have a question. What is it? What's the problem? We have a problem. We're colorblind. We're colorblind. We can't see the colors. Do you have an alternative for us? And the parent says, no, screw off. Too bad. See you later. And I use that story to say, you know, that's a metaphor for a perspective on God that stands in direct opposite to what we're talking about here. It's that notion of arrogant certainty. And because to me personally, now I'm going to be the heretic. If it turned out, when I die, and maybe this is my own form of arrogance and being heretical, but if I die and I do stand before the Almighty, and the Almighty turns out to be the way that parent is in that story and says it's one way or the highway, my attitude's going to be, in the words of Billy Joel, I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints, because that's not the God of Judaism that I was raised to believe in. And it's not a God that would be worthy of my praise. And I would think a God that gave me a mind could tolerate my saying, nah, 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 nah. And so I think the benefit of this theological perspective is it's a hedge against the worst inclinations when it comes to human power and knowledge.
Mm.
People think they have absolute knowledge, and one would think the knowledge of God is absolute knowledge. They think they have absolute power over others. And a world that's built on the notion of striving after absolute power over others goes back to the very beginning of today's lesson, where God begins the Torah with a letter bet for the word bracha, for blessing. And God sort of says, and I'm going to go back and show you how they wrote it, because it really, it kind of, God says, if only, we begin with the word bracha with a bet, if only God says my world will be for a blessing. And what will prevent this world from being for a blessing? People believing that they own God and they can gain absolute knowledge and then lord that knowledge over others, which we know in the history of humanity has been the story of almost every single war that's ever occurred. And more people have died in the history of the world in the name of the Almighty, whatever name of Almighty you wish to choose, in the name of God, people saying, I love God by killing you. Judaism at its heart stands up against that. So, and then I'm going to give you two more answers if we can go on just for a couple more minutes and then take any final questions. There are a couple of other answers to the question, why the letter bet? It says the Torah decidedly does not begin with Aleph because, because Aleph, the first letter, equals the number one. And one is alone and singular. Rabbis went on to say Aleph is a state of isolation. It has no possibility of growth or change. One times anything adds nothing. So the notion also, the Aleph being the silent letter, it has no substance except in relationship to other letters. And so the number two, bet, represents 1 + 1, which represents growth and expansion. The universe is about growth and expansion. And it's really interesting because God doesn't create one human, creates, two, every 2 by 2, 2 by 2, 2 by 2. We have that notion. And the first commandment in the Torah, again, symbolically significant, is Peru or Vu, be fruitful and multiply, takes 2. And so another reason for the letter bet. And then have one more. The bet also refers to this world and the world to come, referring to two worlds. This world, the world to come, a suggestion of afterlife. And we Jews do believe in afterlife, but as I say, we just don't make a religion out of it, but we believe it. We have different interpretations of what it is, just like everything else through history, but we do believe it. And so another interpretation is it starts with a bet to tell us there's this world and the world to come, and not only a suggestion of afterlife, but a repudiation of carpe diem, the notion of seizing the day, that all that matters is what you do in the present, The rabbi said the bet, referring to this world and the next world, is saying there are consequences for what you do now. And we should live our life believing in that, not to be frightened, but to be better. So Judaism believes that doing good in this world with a humble anticipation of a next world prevents spiritual arrogance. And I wonder if you agree with that. I'm not saying there's a judgment day. I don't know. I certainly, and we don't believe in heaven and hell in the traditional way Christians do. But the idea that I'm not just living for this moment, that the goodness I do now makes a difference later, is another interpretation of why the bet is used at the beginning of the Torah.
I think carpe diem more, I never have thought of it as only living in the day. I'm thinking of it as living as much as you can in each day, and to have the day be meaningful, that no day should go by that you just go through it without doing something special. So that to me is what carpe diem means. And then also, I think that the first letter should be Gimel then, because it's not only our lives today and our lives in the afterlife, but what about us before we were brought into existence? I remember someone told me, actually it was our son who's ultra-Orthodox in Israel now, that our children choose us to be their parents when they come into this world. So there should be the life before we become, and then our lives now, and then our afterlife. So what do you think about that, Rabbi?
I think you're onto something. I think we will do a session on Jewish views of afterlife, but I will tell you, Maimonides, and even some contemporary thinkers, and happens to be what I believe in personally, believed in what is called the transmigration of the soul. It's not the same as reincarnation. Reincarnation says your life energy can come back in a variety of forms. Transmigration of the soul, and it's amazing to think Maimonides believed this in the 1200s, is the notion that if you're a human soul, one lifespan is barely enough to learn all that can be learned, and that your soul, your identity, your collection of memory grows over many lifetimes. And as a human life, when this part of the journey ends in this realm, it's not lights off. It's not just a fatal end. There's a transition, and then you live another lifetime, and you will live as many lifetimes you need to live to evolve at the heart level of your existence. The word we use is the level of your soul, which is the collection of all your memories, experience, and most of all, lessons learned. And listen, we know this, we've heard this phrase, and sometimes you have this gut feeling, you meet someone, they're an old soul. So I agree with what you're saying. I don't know, we'd have to find the right word with a gimel to start the Torah. But I think what you're saying is very true and important. Just, it happens to be something I also believe. Anyone else? So I just want to say, just to close, said we would go for about an hour. It's amazing just how much thought our ancestors put into understanding just the first letter of the Torah, just the first letter, and the process of what I call the Jewish interpretive imagination. Jewish interpretive imagination continues. That's one of the great things about being Jewish. It never ends, and there's never just one right answer. And that's why, by the way, let me close with this, that part of what's at the heart of studying the Torah is not a search. It's not about a search for truth. I actually think that the search for truth is at the heart of a lot of the world's conflict. People search for the truth and think once they have it, it gives them the power over others. Judaism is much more about, and you can repeat me many times as you want. Judaism is not about the search for truth. It's about the discovery of meaning, so that we can have a meaningful life. And this open-ended process is just that, just what we did today, is we searched for some more meaning. And we can take all the information we learned, reflect it back today, later on Shabbat, whenever. Maybe this made us think of something we hadn't thought of before, or a perspective on our own life experience that we hadn't considered before. And there you will see in living color how the Jewish interpretive imagination works. And with that, are there any questions?
Oh, I have another random question.
Okay, that's good.
I mean, I know you've studied other traditions and things. I just wondered, earlier on, when you brought up the slide with Bereshit, it just sort of came to me, like, is that sort of the equivalent of darshan? Do you know? In Sanskrit? Do you know? Like, has there been any discussion of that?
I haven't had any discussion of that. What, could you tell us a little more about that?
I don't feel like I'm like an authority, but
That's okay. You don't have to be.
I think the concept is about light and the light of consciousness. And I just wondered if there was that parallel there, if that had been discussed anywhere. That's all.
You know what? I will look that up between now and next time and come back to you with a meaningful answer.
Oh, thank you. I was just curious. Yeah. So do you have, of all these different possible, answers that you talked about, do you have any that you believe yourself?
More than others?
I believe very much in the first. The bet is associated with blessing, with bracha, to teach that the universe was designed, inclined toward goodness. Because I'm not sure I believe personally, I'm not sure to what degree God is currently actually involved in the universe or in the lives of individuals. But that's not to say I don't have mystical moments where coincidences seem like that's more than a coincidence, or, like my mother used to say, someone's watching over you because you could fall into a pile of manure and come up smelling like a rose. She used to say, that's just not light. She used to look at life and say, and a lot of people have experiences like that where it's unlikely, but all of a sudden, like a door opens, or they meet a person who's an angel that changes the course of their life with information or an opportunity. So although I'm not willing to declare I know for sure that God is involved in the lives of individuals, because then I struggle with the fact that, then God prevents some tragedies and not others. And I don't buy that. So I put that question aside. But do I believe that God has a hand in what happens to us? I do. But I believe that is a result of the fact God inclined the universe to blessing, inclines the universe to goodness, inclines the universe toward betterment, the B being for betterment, and for blessing, so that everything we need to perfect the world, to make it better, safer, kinder, more loving, more compassionate, more inclusive, all the things that can incline us in terms of our priorities and our actions and our ethics, all the things needed to solve any of the problems we might face. God put the elements into the universe. We just have to find them, discover them, mix them, put it together, and create. Because we have the mind, a piece of God's mind, just as God was creative, we have that same ability. So I'd say the first one is the most meaningful to me. And it makes me feel that the universe is not a hostile place, by nature. It's a random place. It's also a random place. And when random things happen, it sometimes it's horrible. It's horrible. But I don't hold God responsible for that personally, so to speak. But I am grateful to God for creating a universe where by working together and being creative, we can make it better. We can make life better.
I'd just like to share one thing. This
What does it
was
say?
on a memorial bench of my brother's. He chose to have this put on a bench. It's sitting at a lake in Arvada, and it's just, carpe diem. So
Okay.
seize the day, and with the coming new year, seize the year.
Any other questions before we go?
Thank you.
I hope you found this meaningful. I hope you learned some things. So just a first start. Next month, we're going to talk about who wrote the Torah. We're going to read the story of Noah when he comes off the ark and how he gets drunk. And it's a really very interesting. We're going to study it, and I think you'll enjoy it.
Oh, that's great. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Great.
Thought-provoking.
Shalom. Happy New Year. And thank you so much, Rabbi.
You bet. Pleasure. Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
You're welcome.
Shabbat shalom.
You are
Shabbat shalom.
most welcome.
Thank you for thinking of this.
You bet.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Jay. Yeah.
There are a few suggestions for future
Yeah.
classes.
Yep.
Subjects.
Have a good day, everybody.
You too. Oh, let's see. There's a whole chat.
Yeah, so you can see the whole chat. And
save the chat too if you choose to. We should save the chat on this one.
Oh yeah, we'll save it. And in fact, so I'm going to post this video on our YouTube channel, and I will have the chat transcript here if anybody happens to want it. But
okay.
But it gets saved with the video.
Great.
So Hank and Cynthia, where are you located again?
In Ranchos de Taos.
Oh, okay.
Where?
New Mexico.
Hotel. Oh, okay.
Yeah, just a few miles from Taos.
Great. Wonderful.
That's great. Yeah.
And we had someone here from Illinois. Hey, Charles Zimmerman is from Illinois. So.
Oops. Oh.
Well, I think we were all from Illinois in the beginning.
Ah, I was going to say New Jersey.
Isn't that where God created the world, in Illinois?